Tucson's largest export is war. Sure, we've got sunshine, saguaros, scenic vistas, margaritas and mariachis, but what we're selling the most of in economic and political impact is war. In Tucson, we've been sold on war, we've been suckered into war. For decades, we've been suckled by war, and it sucks. The tools of empire are machined and oiled in our community and sent out upon the world. And not that this is anything unique, as Kathleen mentioned. We know how military money and prestige are sprinkled across the congressional districts like crack cocaine, sure to hook a few politicians who will keep coming back jonesing for more. But it is our backyard. And we're right here on the border where we have witnessed firsthand some of the human costs of modern empire for decades. Now, I'm not sure what is to be done in the historical context, but whatever it is, it has to start with an education of ourselves about just what is being done with our taxes and our yard by our neighbors and in our name. And I have kind of a lot to go through, and I'll try not to stray too far off on my own rants and save that for later, but here we go. Raytheon Missile Systems, headquartered in Tucson, is the world's largest producer of guided missiles and bombs. Raytheon sells weapons of increasing sophistication to scores of nations, allies and enemies of U.S. allies alike, on every continent save Antarctica, and including a few, quote, undisclosed countries. And Tucson's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base has for decades been at the center of global power projection. From hosting Titan intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles to training the operators of nuclear-armed ground-launched cruise missiles, from the A-10, the ground support combat aircraft and their radioactive ammunition, to now, for nearly a decade, remotely piloted armed drones raining death around the world. So first, a little bit of historical background about Raytheon. In 1951, the U.S. was at war with Korea. The billionaire Howard Hughes needed a new exclusive missile factory for the first ever radar-controlled air-to-air missile. Culver City, where his factory was in California, he thought was too close to the coast and vulnerable. So Tucson kind of won in a rather secret competition. And in fact, city developers and power brokers announced their deal the same day that the bulldozers went into action, blading the access road from the Nogales Highway into land purchased from the Tucson Airport Authority for what was the largest industrial development in Tucson's history. A few months later, in October of 1951, the security chief at the new Hughes plant, a Mr. Weld, spoke about the potential vulnerability of the new site. He said, quote, "With plant construction entering its final stages, there's no room for prying eyes or unauthorized visitors. Espionage isn't a fictional device, it's an actual menace, even here in Tucson. There are about 158 active communists in Arizona. And their danger exists in their espionage systems, not in their political ideology." Well, I thought that was just a humorous footnote. 30 years on, in the early 1980s, when Hughes closed one California factory, Tucson and Pima County offered a $5 million road improvement and relocation assistance deal to move all of that production to Arizona. A decade later, in '92, Hughes purchased the General Dynamics missile business, and the city gave them a $25 million tax break to move those production lines to Tucson, including for the Tomahawk cruise missile. 5 years later, in '97, Hughes was acquired by Raytheon, and the missile business again expanded the operations in Tucson. So currently there's about 11,000 or so full-time equivalent employees at Raytheon's Tucson Missile Systems. And there's about another 1,000 Missile Systems Division employees in 4 other states. 90% of the larger Raytheon Corporation, which has I think 5 or 6 different divisions, 90% of Raytheon's corporate profits are from war production, principally the Missile Systems Division, and smaller amounts in other divisions. This is their profit-generating mechanism here in Tucson. In the last 5 years, Raytheon has even led Lockheed Martin in the number of contracts registered as foreign military sales. And today, the county is relocating roads to lure more Raytheon business here by giving them room to expand. And confirming that the Tucson is hooked on war, County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry last year said, "We need to remove as many obstacles as possible that limit Raytheon's ability to expand and bring more quality jobs to the region." So Raytheon's niche in this arms market is summarized by a little glowing paragraph from suncorridorinc.com. That's one of the local regional economic development authorities. They say about Raytheon, leveraging its capabilities in advanced airframes, guidance and navigation systems, high-resolution sensors, targeting and netted systems, the missile systems broad weapons portfolio includes missiles, guided munitions, projectiles, kinetic kill vehicles, space vehicles, and directed energy systems. So, looking a little bit deeper into this broad weapons portfolio, and to answer the question that a lot of people ask, so what do they do out at Raytheon? Let's start with that big folder that's marked missiles. There are several different kinds of air-to-air combat missiles that they make at Raytheon, names such as Sidewinder and AMRAAM. They have a number of different ship defense missiles and gun systems, the Phalanx. There are several variations of what they call the Standard Missile. There's the 1, the 2, the 3, the Block A, the Block B, etc. There are the small Griffin guided missiles. This is about this size, 40 inches long, 35 pounds. They're half the size of the better-known Hellfire missile that are launched from Predator and Reaper drones. Now they can pack 4 of them where there used to be just 2 Hellfire missiles. They can now pack 4 Griffins. And of course, the premier missile made in Tucson is the Tomahawk cruise missile. Although these are no longer engineered as nuclear-capable missiles, they still have a devastating impact and are great for drive-by wars. And they were made in San Diego, as I mentioned earlier, so that in 1991, they were critical for knocking out all of the electrical and water and sanitation infrastructure in Iraq, setting the stage for the decade of starvation under the sanctions in the 1990s. By the time of 1999, and Bill Clinton using Tomahawk cruise missiles for warfare in Somalia, Afghanistan, and the Balkan states, those Tomahawks were made here in Tucson. The latest Block 4 Tomahawk cruise missile has cluster munition options, cluster bombs, and it has the capability to loiter, to circle around potential targets, do live battle damage assessment, and receive new targeting coordinates to go in for the kill. Maybe that's the people coming after the first missile struck. They have a guided munitions folder that has the guided Excalibur artillery shell. They now make an artillery shell that's launched out of a big gun, computer guided through the global positioning satellite system to hit its target accurately. They have projectiles. I'm not sure what they mean exactly by projectiles other than missiles, but I'll put in here one of the top selling items from Raytheon in Tucson is the Paveway guided bomb kit. Basically, they can take any gravity bomb and they strap on these GPS, global positioning system controlled tail fins, and voila, you have a guided bomb that is a more accurate bomb. Now, I'm not going to get into whether more accurate is better because there's less collateral damage. I think there's compelling evidence to show that there is maybe more collateral damage per use of these type of munitions because it makes it easier to use them almost. If you imagine that they're so precision targeted, you're more likely, in the case of our drone warfare, to be using them in a lot of places where maybe we wouldn't be waging more conventional airstrikes. Most recently, The Intercept has documented photographs from Yemen, where a funeral was bombed and about 130 civilians were recently killed. And the documentary evidence shows that paveway kit was made in Tucson. And we sold it to Saudi Arabia, who's a cash customer. Saudi Arabia doesn't get foreign military tax, assistance with tax credits. That means we're paying for their weapons to buy from corporations here that profit from it. They also make out at Raytheon. I mean, if you're not in a technological trance yet, we could be soon. They make kinetic kill vehicles. These are missile interceptors. Kinetic kill means they're supposed to hit the incoming missile and blow it to smithereens just by the force of impact at supersonic speeds. And they make them in a few different sizes for a few different applications. Generally, they've not been as successful as promoted, and they can easily be overwhelmed by a lot of decoys if that is your opponent's intent, is to actually have a strike against your missile defense system. They have directed energy systems. You may have seen photographs in North Dakota of the LRAD, the long-range acoustical device that fires sound beams to make it impossible to stay in an area because your ears hurt. Well, Raytheon, they made a device of non-lethal crowd control, those are the words that were used, weapon, that fires, I'm not sure if it's microwave energy, but it basically, your skin starts to heat up and you feel intense growing pain, a burning sensation in your epidermal layers until you get out of the range of that device. I don't know if they're still making those, but this is something that they worked on here in Tucson. And now they have the space vehicle folder in this great weapons portfolio. Most recently includes, just in the last couple of days in the Arizona Daily Star, 2,000 more jobs at Raytheon. One of the jobs that they're going to have is tiny nano satellites to help troops on the ground. Satellites that will be launched into low orbit and provide real-time video to soldiers on the ground. Their smartphones, they can dial up what's it look like down over there and plan their attacks. And they're working on collaborative projects with Norway, a naval strike missile, a long-range precision fire missile, ground-to-ground missile, and something called the LMAMS, the Lethal Miniature Aerial Missile System. It is described as a man-packed, canister-launched, airborne loitering system. So let me be the man and unpack that. It's like a lethal hybrid of a missile and a drone, and they can carry it in a backpack. And they launch it out of the tube, and it loiters around the immediate battlefield for a little while, and they can decide again with their little cell phone or iPad where it's going to strike. Because they have these pictures from nano satellites, as well, to help guide them on the larger battlefield. So my point is this: Air Force Plant 44, which is what it is because the Air Force bought it soon after Hughes acquired it, and they rent it to Raytheon for a nominal $1 or $25 a year fee. This is not a simple machine shop, dutifully fulfilling government orders for a tidy profit. This is a corporation that has chosen to and succeeded in making products for its investor, making profit for its investors from war. And in the pursuit of that profit, Raytheon engineers and managers imagine the warfare of the future. And they work to create that reality. Our future dependent upon war. And to quote their own publicity, through its advanced programs activities, the business is focused on the development and early introduction of next generation end-to-end system solutions, architectures, and mission capabilities for the war fighter. Missile Systems is also applying its technologies to new and adjacent markets, such as homeland security and space exploration. So the unasked question in all of this, to me, is, for how long can we continue to develop our own community at such a great cost to others around the world? And it's not just a question that maybe Tucson has failed to ask publicly, but of course the whole country has failed to ask that question. I'm going to move on to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And again, there's history there. I can talk about the protest history there a little bit that I've seen in the last 30-some years that I've been coming to Tucson. And I suspect there were protests at Hughes and Davis-Monthan during the Vietnam era and about the Titan nuclear missiles. Maybe some of you can share that, I don't know. But I'll start in 1983, in June of 1983, when Brian Flagg and Rhea Miller, then at the Casa Maria Catholic Worker in Tucson, established a peace camp outside the Craycroft Road Gate at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. It was an act of international solidarity with peace camps outside military bases across Europe where the nuclear-armed ground-launched cruise missile was being deployed. Now this, for those of you that don't remember, might not have been here in the late 1970s and early 80s. This was a major strategic escalation of the nuclear arms race that Jimmy Carter initiated and Ronald Reagan continued. The most notorious of the European peace camps was at the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in England. Here in Tucson, the 868th Tactical Missile Training Group was established as the only place that the operators for those missiles over in Europe were trained. And so Brian and Rhea and others established a peace camp here in solidarity. And for about 6 months, it persisted as a public anti-nuclear presence and a focus for nonviolent action. And it even generated a landmark ruling about trespass on military bases in the 9th Federal Court of Appeals, U.S. versus Walsh. If you see Jim Walsh, you can say thanks for the 9th Circuit ruling.
He's not here today?
I don't see Jim here. And the historical footnote, though, for Davis-Monthan and the ground-launched cruise missiles is, we won. We won. In England, the cruise missile convoys were supposed to go out and practice. There was a convoy of launchers, control vehicles, and security vehicles. And they were supposed to go out and blend into the countryside and have the strategic or the tactical advantage of being able to initiate a surprise attack or a retaliation with these ground-launched cruise missiles. Every single practice deployment over several years out of the Greenham Common Air Force Base was tracked and monitored as it went through the lanes in the village of the Salisbury Plain. And it was met with creative nonviolent resistance, and all this was in the days before cell phones. And robbed of that tactical advantage, the missiles became a bargaining piece, and in 1988, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty removed all of those missiles, and there was a big party out at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in 1988 where they took big metal saws and made a big deal with the Russians here and the Americans here, cutting in half these cruise missiles. And so that also in 1988 marked the end of what had succeeded the peace camp, which were a series of weekly vigils. They called themselves the Friday Morning Breakfast Club. So with the cutting in half of the cruise missiles, the Breakfast Club stopped vigiling out there. So a few years later, in '95, some of you might remember Pat Burney and Betty Schroeder. Together with Pat and Betty, my wife Felice and I decided that we would resume a regular vigil at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Sometime after the celebration of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1995, we decided that it was important to be present out there regularly. So the focus of the vigil then was on the tragedy unfolding in Iraq over the 1991 use of depleted uranium ammunition. Nearly all of it fired by the A-10s. All the A-10s train at Davis-Monthan. They're based all around the world, but they all come here to train at some point. Then as now, the U.S. refusal to release targeting coordinates for this ammunition has hampered not only identification, remediation, and cleanup efforts on the ground in Iraq, but it has also harmed veterans who cannot prove that they worked in contaminated areas to support their claims for a service-related disability. So for years we had vigil signs that said, "Where's the depleted uranium?" And we asked the A-10 pilots to let us know, where did you fire depleted uranium? Well, they weren't able to answer us, and the Pentagon still hasn't. And I'll come back to the depleted uranium in a minute. But to continue on to why we protest now at Davis-Monthan, in 2007, they brought in a group of Air National Guard pilots for Predator drones. Davis-Monthan is one of the first Air Force bases outside of Creech Air Force Base in Nevada to host an armed drone unit. And it was one of the first also to have an Air National Guard instead of regular Air Force as the principal operator of armed drones. Celebrated with newspaper and TV coverage when it was established, news about the local unit dried up for years as the controversy over drone warfare grew nationally and internationally. And now armed drone missions are being flown in so many places, and each mission is shrouded in such operational secrecy that we have no idea who is being bombed by the Air National Guard members sitting in the control stations a stone's throw from the Craycroft Gate. From that intersection, if you're out there, and I know I've shown people who have come out to vigil, if you look southwest over a field of solar panels, you can see the paved lot where the mobile ground control stations are parked just outside the new headquarters of the Arizona Air National Guard. You can see a flagpole and a satellite communication tower that complete the scene. To my mind, they've brought the field of battle home, right here to Tucson. And as I understand the laws of war, that part of Davis-Monthan at least is a legitimate target of any so-called enemy. And in a recent rare news article about the subject, Davis-Monthan is reported now in the running for a second drone unit, this time piloting the larger, more lethal Reaper drone. I've got a few more minutes. I'm going to go back to finish up to talk about the A-10s and depleted uranium, because there have been some interesting new developments on this subject. The A-10 was designed to repel a land invasion in Central Europe and battling with Soviet tanks coming through the Fulda Gap in Germany and blasting the tanks to bits with a machine gun made to fire depleted uranium ammunition, and the whole airplane was built around that Gatling gun in the front of the A-10. And it fires two different kinds of ammunition. So if you don't mind try to steer clear too much science, but this is important. It has a high explosive ammunition that just burns things up, blows them up. And it also has an armor-piercing ammunition. That's the depleted uranium. We won't go into the science, but that's what it does. It goes through armor a lot better than traditional ammunition. And it's radioactive. So they fire a mix that's mostly this depleted uranium and a little bit of this high explosive ammunition. Or they can just fire all the high explosive ammunition. It just depends on what they load up before the plane takes off. That's what they have to use out of that gun. They also fire missiles and drop bombs in addition, but they're built around this gun. Now, it is radioactive ammunition. Depleted uranium, it still has radiation. It's a long-lived, sort of low level, but its danger is when it is ingested and inhaled. And if you have depleted uranium ammunition hitting a hard target, it ignites, you have ash, and that ash is radioactive, and it blows in the wind. It gets in the soil, into the food. Children playing in the soil and putting their hands in their face, they breathe it. These are pathways of exposure that are not fully understood. Before its entry into service, a legal review of the A-10's radioactive, chemically toxic, and incendiary depleted uranium ammunition placed restrictions on its use. Civilian areas were to be avoided, as were troops, and the weapons were only to be used against armored targets unless other weapons were unavailable. In 1991, A-10s fired about 300 tons of depleted uranium during the invasion of Iraq. Tanks, helicopters, and Bradley fighting vehicles fired the small percentage otherwise of depleted uranium ammunition that they fire. Again, in the Balkans in '99, the U.S. unleashed about 30 tons. Again, most of it was from the A-10s. And in 2003, back again to Iraq, the most recent data indicates that about 180,000 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition were fired into Iraq in the first month of the war in 2003. More than 60 tons of depleted uranium. This is refined metallic depleted uranium. That's about half as much as, again, as much as was used in '91. So most of it was in '91, half again as much in 2003. But again, the United States has done nothing to inform the Iraqis of where they should go to clean it up. And if you want a hint about, to understand maybe why we would be concerned to clean it up, let's look at the kind of regulations that govern the use of, or the production and the processing of depleted uranium in most countries where this material is available. For instance, a manufacturer of depleted uranium products in Colony, New York, outside of Albany, was shut down a couple of decades ago for off-site emissions that were the equivalent of just a handful, 4 or 5 depleted uranium rounds. Now, in fact, it was estimated to have spewed tons of stuff over the neighborhoods surrounding the plant. But that's all it took for regulatory authorities to shut it down. DU military test range cleanup requires technicians to don hazmat suits and respirators, and special handling protocols govern DU munitions in storage and deployment to minimize exposure to soldiers. International demining standards spell out special precautionary steps to take when clearing areas also known to be contaminated with depleted uranium. Iraq has been asking for the targeting data from the United States for over a decade. And the United States has still not provided that information. Now recently, the most recent news that I have to share is that the National Security Archives at George Washington University got a hold of targeting data for the first month of the 2003 war. And it was turned over to a group in Britain, the International Campaign to Ban Uranium Weapons, and a group in the Netherlands called PAX. And they produced a study that is just out called Targets of Opportunity. And it describes, in fact, what targets were hit. And 2/3 of the targets hit were soft targets. They were not armor. There were troop concentrations. There were other buildings. There were other military vehicles. They were not armor. And they were able to triple the number of known places where there is likely to be depleted uranium contamination on Iraq by their analysis of this recently uncovered information. Now, A-10s are back in service in Iraq again right now. The Pentagon made the point to say that when we were using A-10s in Libya a few years ago, they were not going to use depleted uranium ammunition. There seemed to be some acknowledgement of the international opprobrium about using depleted uranium. A Pentagon official was reported saying about 2.5 years ago, when we first sent more A-10s into Iraq, that they would probably not be using it because they didn't see a need to. Last spring, when they said they were sending more A-10s and upping the tempo, I wrote a letter to Martha McSally and I said, so now that there's more A-10s and we've upped the tempo, what's the Pentagon's position on the use of depleted uranium? And I didn't get a reply until I actually got her military affairs guy on the phone in DC. And he said, okay, I'll look into it. And he sent back something from the Pentagon that says, no, we haven't had a need to. And the very next day he said, oh, actually, no, we have. And he reported that on 2 dates back in November last year, depleted uranium was used. Further analysis, I took that small bit of information and I passed it along to these organizations in Holland and England because I felt that they could do more with this new information. Part of the problem with using depleted uranium is it really plays into the narrative that we're breeding more, that causes us to be breeding more terrorists than we're killing. This is an international narrative now that the United States, not only attacks Muslims, but poisons their lands forever. So the continuing use of depleted uranium has, these deep political implications beyond the long-term health impact. I'll stop there and I'll pass out, or if you want, the story is filled out here in the URL for more of the information. The United States confirms that it has fired depleted uranium in Syria. The report that I got back from McSally's office was then later confirmed just a few weeks ago by a reporter who has a lot more credibility than I would have had. First, the Pentagon said, oh no, they're confused about what combat mix is. And I thought, well, no, combat mix has been the depleted uranium all along. And so after a little more pressure from other reporters, it was confirmed that yes, the Pentagon has said, yes, we did use depleted uranium and we would continue to do so. So that's Tucson. This is our place in the world. Arizona has a legacy of the five C's: copper, cattle, cotton, citrus, climate, and now carnage. So why do we vigil out at Raytheon and Davis-Monthan? At its root meaning, to vigil is to be the one who watches. To watch, one must stay awake. To stay awake is to remain conscious. Sometimes among friends and in our community, we struggle about how to respond to tragedy. And sometimes the first thing we can do is simply to witness, to be present, to watch. And so we vigil once a month at Raytheon and Davis-Monthan as a way to be conscious, to be awake to the reality of Tucson's major economic export. As well, we believe that it is important to demonstrate our sorrow and outrage at the sufferings caused by war. When she vigils, my wife Felice thinks of the many voiceless victims of Davis-Monthan and Raytheon. She stands for them, in a small way bringing awareness of them into our community. We believe that our small presence is an invitation to those driving by to make peace public in their own lives and to be emboldened to work for peace and against war. We want to encourage public protest because we believe in the untapped potential of mass nonviolent direct action. We're just practicing some of the basics because we know that if we aren't exercising our rights, they will be taken from us. We don't oppose those working at Raytheon, and we understand the need for good-paying jobs in Tucson. We oppose the militarism that exploits this need, developing our own community at the expense of others around the world. So I hope you can join us sometime at a vigil. And if you'd like to see what it looks like, I'll pass around a picture of us vigiling. One side's Davis-Monthan, the other side's Raytheon. So there's a little bit. It's 20 after, so we're not yet at 6:30. If there's something you missed because you nodded off, that's okay. Ask now.
I actually have a question that
Yes.
you may have answered, but
Go ahead.
so you said that their logic was that depleted uranium will be used in places that the ashes won't spread.
Well, or no, they want to use it in places where there's a hard targets.
So, but my point being, so there is really no way that you can prevent ashes from spread. Right?
Absolutely correct as
they
well.
They really have like a reasoning or a.
And they deny that they have any responsibility for post-conflict cleanup.
Oh wow. Oh.
And it's interesting that part of the
What's their rationale for that?
because there are no established international norms. So there are norms about cluster munitions, and there are norms about landmines. There's no norms about depleted uranium munitions. Yeah, there's.
When we want to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a growing awareness in the international humanitarian community of what they call the toxic remnants of war, because there's a lot of toxins that end up on the battlefield beyond just depleted uranium.
Right, of course.
And whose responsibility for cleaning up is that?
Except the humanitarian community is all of us, the whole planet.
Yeah, it's our responsibility, right? Yeah, yeah.
So, a couple things on the topic of uranium. The first thing is to point out is that the radioactivity of depleted uranium is actually quite low. Most of the toxicity results from the fact that uranium is a heavy metal, and it has a lot of the same detrimental health effects as lead, for instance.
Correct. Yeah.
And the other thing is, speaking of uranium, we have a big